You need to stop this right now and listen to me. This kind of behavior will not be tolerated.
They say a mother's love is unconditional, a safety net that catches you before you hit the ground. But in the sterile, high-ceilinged halls of the Vance Manor, love was a ledger, and I was always written in the red. My mother, Eleanor Vance, didn't see children in the way other parents did. She saw potential assets, human capital to be molded into the next generation of corporate steel. My brother, Marcus, was her blue-chip stock, the golden boy who inherited her steel-trapped mind and her ruthless, calculated ambition. From the moment he could speak, he was being groomed for the throne, his every word a rehearsal for a boardroom presentation. I, on the other hand, was the bad investment, the line item she couldn't wait to write off. To her, I was Julian, the boy who preferred sketching the intricate gargoyles of our estate in the margins of his notebooks rather than studying the shifting trends of the global market. I was the failure she whispered about to her high society colleagues over crystal glasses of scotch, the quiet disappointment she didn't even bother to hide behind a veil of maternal politeness. I vividly remember the cold, suffocating dinners where silence was the loudest sound in the room, broken only by the rhythmic clinking of silver against fine china. Those meals were a stage for Marcus to showcase his prowess, reciting the day's closing numbers, while my mother looked at him with a predatory pride. When it was my turn to speak, the air would turn to ice. If I mentioned a new technique I'd learned in my art class or showed a glimpse of a charcoal drawing, she wouldn't even look up from her plate. She would simply sigh, a long, weary sound that carried the weight of 1,000 unmet expectations, and ask Marcus a follow-up question about his economics tutor. Every achievement Marcus made, no matter how small, was celebrated with a formal toast and a nod of approval that I would have traded my soul for. Meanwhile, my art awards, the only things that gave me a sense of worth, were tossed into the trash bins by the house staff before the ink on the certificates was even dry. She told me repeatedly that I lacked the killer instinct required to survive the Vance legacy, that I was too soft, too distracted by pretty colors, to understand the brutal reality of power. The tension reached a breaking point on the day I turned 18. While other boys were being gifted cars or trust funds, I was given an ultimatum. My mother stood in the doorway of her mahogany-paneled office, silhouetted by the harsh light of a city skyline that she felt she owned. She told me that if I didn't enroll in the business program she had hand-selected for me, I would no longer be a Vance. I looked at her, seeing not a mother, but a creditor demanding a debt I could never pay. I chose my freedom. I packed a single worn duffel bag with my charcoal sticks, a few changes of clothes, and the burning desire to never see that house again. She didn't ask where I was going, if I had money for a meal, or where I would sleep that night. She didn't offer a hug or even a goodbye. She just stood there, her gray eyes like chips of flint, and said with a voice that didn't waver, "Don't come crawling back when the real world realizes you have nothing of value to offer, Julian. When you are starving and forgotten, remember that you chose to be a failure." I walked out into the rain without looking back, the iron gates of the estate clicking shut like the door of a prison cell I had finally managed to escape. For the first 10 years of my new life, those words were the fuel that kept me going through the coldest nights, a reminder that my only duty was to prove her wrong.
I didn't crawl back, though there were many nights in those early years when the hunger was a physical weight in my stomach and the cold of a radiatorless apartment threatened to break my spirit. I disappeared into the gray, unforgiving concrete jungle of the city, deliberately shedding the Vance name like a poisoned skin. I worked 3 back-breaking jobs, scrubbing floors in luxury hotels where people like my mother stayed, waiting tables until my legs went numb, and spending every remaining hour of my life in a tiny, cramped studio where the roof leaked and the heater groaned like a dying beast. My workspace was a makeshift desk salvaged from a dumpster, illuminated by a single flickering light bulb that cast long, dancing shadows over my architectural drawings. I spent 10 long years building a life out of the very scraps she thought were worthless, turning my perceived failure into a weapon of creation. I founded a design firm I named Aurelius, a name that sounded nothing like the corporate coldness of Vance Enterprises. At Aurelius, we didn't just build structures, we built spaces that breathed, valuing the human soul over cold spreadsheets and turning raw, jagged emotion into light-filled architecture. I became a ghost to my biological family, carving out a reputation in the industry that had absolutely nothing to do with my mother's shadow or her blood money. While I was out in the world learning the true cost of a dollar and the value of a dream, Marcus was busy climbing the pre-greased corporate ladder of her crumbling empire, mistaking his mother's favoritism for genuine talent. I watched from a distance as my firm grew, winning contracts that the big corporate giants usually monopolized, because I understood something my mother never could. People don't want to live in glass boxes, they want to live in stories. I learned that my supposed weakness, my empathy, and my eye for beauty was actually my greatest professional strength, the secret ingredient that allowed me to see potential where she only saw a profit margin. I built my own mountain from the ground up, brick by painful brick, while her mountain was quietly being hollowed out by greed and short-sightedness. I had finally found peace in my anonymity, a quiet success that felt more solid than anything I had ever known in that mahogany-paneled prison of my youth. I thought I had finally outrun the ghost of Eleanor Vance, believing that the distance I had put between us was enough to keep her from ever reaching me again. But the universe has a cruel way of folding distance back onto itself when you least expect it. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, a day that started with the mundane scent of fresh coffee and the promise of a new project. The vibration of the phone on my marble kitchen counter felt like a tremor before an earthquake. It wasn't a call of love, and it certainly wasn't a long overdue plea for maternal forgiveness. It was a cold, clinical summons from a ghost I thought I had laid to rest. Vance Enterprises, the invincible titan of the industry, was finally, catastrophically, crumbling under its own weight. A legal loophole hidden deep within a forgotten trust fund established by my grandfather, a man who had seen the coldness in his own daughter long before I did, had surfaced like a shark in dark water. A series of disastrous, ego-driven board decisions led by Marcus had bled the company dry, leading to a single, impossible reality. Eleanor Vance was losing everything she had ever sacrificed her soul for. The empire she had traded her son's love to preserve was hemorrhaging assets, and because of a specific ironclad clause in my grandfather's will, I was the only person left with the legal authority to stop the bleeding. The woman who told me I had nothing of value to offer now discovered that the only thing of value she had left was my signature. Walking back into the Vance Enterprises skyscraper felt like stepping into a graveyard where my own childhood had been buried years ago. The architecture was exactly as I remembered, monolithic, intimidating, and devoid of any human warmth. As I crossed the lobby, the clicking of my boots on the polished black marble echoed like a countdown. The security guards, men in suits who looked like they were guarding a funeral, didn't ask for my ID. They simply stepped aside as if they had been instructed to let the prodigal son return to the scene of the crime. I stood in the elevator, watching the numbers climb toward the penthouse boardroom, and for a moment I caught my reflection in the brushed steel doors. I didn't see the broken boy who had left a decade ago. I saw a man who had built himself out of the ashes of rejection. The air inside the building was pressurized and cold, smelling of expensive furniture polish and the sharp metallic scent of corporate desperation. It was an atmosphere I had spent 10 years trying to scrub off my skin, yet here I was, breathing it in once more, not as a victim, but as the only person in the world who could stop the walls from closing in.
When the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open, the silence was so thick it felt physical. The room was a shrine to power, a long mahogany table that could seat 30, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, and walls lined with portraits of men who had never known the meaning of failure. At the far end of that table sat my mother. She looked smaller than I remembered, as if the weight of her collapsing empire had physically compressed her. The steel in her hair was now matched by a gray, ash-colored fatigue in her skin, and her eyes, once sharp enough to cut through any argument, looked hollowed out by fear. Beside her sat Marcus, the golden boy who had finally tarnished. He was slumped in his chair, his designer silk tie loosened and his head buried in his hands, unable to even glance in my direction. He was the picture of a man who had been given everything and realized too late that he possessed nothing of his own. The irony wasn't lost on me. The one who stayed had destroyed the legacy, while the one who was cast out was the only one capable of resurrecting it. My mother didn't rise to greet me. She didn't offer a word of apology for the decade of silence or the lifetimes of cruelty. There was no "I've missed you" or "I was wrong." Instead, she looked at me with a desperate, frantic intensity that made my stomach turn. With a hand that shook despite her best efforts to remain composed, she pushed a thick stack of legal documents across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. The papers slid toward me with a soft, sliding sound that felt like a final surrender. Atop the pile sat a gold fountain pen, the very same pen she had used to sign the documents that disinherited me and funded Marcus's rise. "Sign it, Julian," her voice a fragile whisper that tried and failed to mimic her old authority. "The board is meeting in 20 minutes. If your signature isn't on that line by then, the liquidation begins. Everything your grandfather built, everything I worked my entire life to protect, will be gone by sunset. It is your duty as a Vance to save this family legacy." I looked at the papers, then at the pen, and finally into the eyes of the woman who had spent 20 years telling me I was a failure. The power in the room had shifted so completely that I could feel the air vibrating with the weight of it. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for her approval. She was waiting for mine. I picked up the gold fountain pen, its weight familiar and cold against my palm, a relic of a world that had tried to crush my spirit before it even had a chance to soar. I looked down at the signature line, a small, unassuming space that held the power to resurrect a dying empire or let it crumble into the dust of history. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the frantic, shallow breathing of my brother and the rhythmic ticking of the marble clock on the wall. My mother's eyes were locked on my hand, her entire existence narrowed down to the movement of that nib. She wasn't seeing her son. She was seeing a lifeline, a legal technicality that could undo a decade of her own arrogance. I felt the phantom pain of every birthday she forgot, every drawing she burned, and every time she had called me a failure with a smile that never reached her eyes. The irony was a bitter tonic. The worthless son was now the only person in the room with any real currency. I realized then that she hadn't summoned me out of love or even regret. She had summoned me because I was the only tool left in her box that wasn't broken. For a long moment, I simply held the pen, hovering just millimeters above the parchment. I could feel Eleanor's pulse racing from across the table, her composure finally fracturing as the seconds ticked toward the deadline. "Julian, please," she whispered, and it was the first time in my life I had ever heard her use that word. It wasn't a plea for a relationship. It was a plea for her own ego, for the glass towers and the name on the letterhead. I looked at Marcus, who remained a hollow shell of the man he was supposed to be, and then back at the woman who had traded my childhood for a seat at this table. In that moment, the anger that had fueled my success for 10 years didn't vanish, but it transformed into something else, a profound, quiet pity. She had spent her whole life building a fortress of wealth, only to find herself trapped inside it, begging the boy she had exiled to let her out. I knew that if I refused to sign, I would be justified. I could walk out and watch the Vance name be erased from the skyline by sunset, a poetic justice for the way she had tried to erase me. But as I looked at the document, I realized that my freedom didn't lie in her destruction. If I let the company fail out of spite, I was still letting her control my actions. I was still the boy reacting to her cruelty. To truly move on, I had to be the man who was beyond her reach. With a steady hand and a fluid, artistic motion, I signed my name. Not Julian Vance, the ghost of her legacy, but the signature I had used to build my own life, a mark of my own making. I slid the papers back across the mahogany surface with a soft, final click. "There is your signature, Mother," I said, my voice calm and devoid of the tremors that had once defined my interactions with her. "The company is safe. Your legacy is intact." Her eyes widened with a mix of relief and a sudden sharp realization that she had won the battle but lost the war. I stood up, adjusting my coat, and didn't wait for her thanks. As I walked toward the door, I felt the invisible chains of 20 years finally snap. I left the gold pan on the table, a gift for a woman who had everything but possessed nothing. I walked out of the building and into the warm, golden light of the afternoon, a failure who had finally succeeded in the only way that actually mattered. I was finally, truly free.